Okay, hello everyone. My name's Louise. I'm from the Western Sussex Rivers Trust. Welcome to a second of our Wednesday webinars. Today we are joined by Dave Goulson, who's going to be talking to you about insects and pesticides and a little bit about how pet flea and tick treatments are affecting our waterways. Wednesday webinars is a free monthly series of talks all around topics to do with the water environment. Last month's webinar was with Joe Bradley from Stormwater Shepherds, all about highway runoff. The recording for that is available via our website. All of the webinars will be recorded. So if you want to share the recording, it'll be available on our website and I will email everybody to let you know when that's available. You can add your questions to the Q&A and Dave will attempt to answer your questions at the end. And I'm just going to share something with you. So this is some events that we've got coming up. I know a lot of people on the call are not from our local area, but if you do live anywhere near Midhurst in West Sussex, then we have a film night coming up next week with a talk by Tony Whitbread, who is the president of the Sussex Wildlife Trust and also one of the Western Sussex Rivers Trust's trustees. And the film is 2040, which is a look into the future, all about climate change, but actually presents a story of hope where humans could in fact reverse the impacts of global warming. So if you are in the local area, do come and join us at that in Midhurst. Next month's webinar is with Keith Herbert from Southern Water, talking about how sewage is getting into our waterways and what we can do to stop that from happening. We do think it's really important that we work in cooperation with the water companies. So I'm really pleased that Keith's able to join us and explain some of the engineering solutions that are available to try and stop sewage getting into our waterways. So I will now hand over to Dave. So if you want to get started, Dave, when you're ready.
Okay, thanks, Louise. Let me just try and share my slides. There was a bit of a moment of truth. Nearly there. Okay, hopefully. Can you see that, Louise?
Yep, I can see
Okay,
it.
that hopefully means everyone else can see it too, which would be good. Okay, shall I start? We're good to go.
Yep, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Thanks for tuning in on a cold, dark November night. I'm going to talk tonight about insects and the effects of pesticides on them. And as Louise said, I will talk a little bit specifically about flea and tick treatments and their role in river pollution. I've been interested in insects all my life. Since I was a little boy, I was collecting caterpillars in the primary school playground. And been lucky, I guess, that I've managed to make a living out of my childhood hobby. Um, I don't think I was that weird actually. I think most kids, given half a chance, are fascinated by insects. This is my youngest son a few years ago. He hates that I show this picture, but there he is with his pet cockchafer Colin. And Seth is still really fascinated by insects now as a teenager because he's had lots of chance to encounter them to sadly, Colin's no longer with us, but we have lots of insects in our garden, and so he's familiar with them and thinks they're really cool, and hopefully he'll always will. But the sad reality is, most people, if they ever do like insects, by the time they are teenagers and adults, they're frightened of them. Their reaction is usually, if anything buzzes near them, is usually to try and kill it, which I find really sad, and. Um, that attitude, I think, is beautifully captured by this sign I came across. Um, This was on the University of South Wales campus. So the top half is in Welsh, but the bottom half, there you go. Warning, flying insects in this area. Run for your lives. There's a butterfly or a bee. And all it was some swarming ants, which are completely harmless, but somebody thought it was worth printing out this giant red and white sign to terrify people. Just shows a certain disconnect with the natural world, I think. Anyway, I think insects are amazing critters. They're incredibly diverse. They're amongst the oldest creatures on Earth, actually. The first insects evolved about 480 million years ago, which is a mind-boggling amount of time. That means they're twice as old as the first dinosaurs. Um, and because they've been here so long, they've had time to speciate into, well, we know we've so far named about 1.1 or so million species of insect globally, which means they make up the majority of all known species of anything on the planet. But what's really fascinating, I think, is that we know there are lots of insects we haven't yet found. New insects are described every year, and various estimates suggest that there are probably somewhere between 3 and 5 million more insects on our planet that we haven't even seen yet, which is just astonishing. Who knows what amazing creatures are out there waiting for us to find them. Sadly, though, insects are in decline broadly. There's lots of evidence for this from around the world. This is a study I was involved in Germany, or at least these are the data from it, which is based on malaise trapping. That sort of funny looking structure is a malaise trap. It catches flying insects. And German entomologists have been malaise trapping on their nature reserves since 1989. And what the chart shows is the biomass of insects, of flying insects caught per trap per day, and how it changed between 1989 and 2016. And you can see it fell. Um, this was at sites scattered across Germany. On average, the catch fell by 76% in 26 years, 27 years. Um, which is pretty terrifying. The thought that seemingly three-quarters of the insects disappeared from German nature reserves in just over a quarter of a century. Um, as far as we can tell, this isn't something unique to Germany. I'm just going to give you one other example, an exotic one. Um, so this picture was taken in 1984, I think, uh, in a national park in Costa Rica. It's a light trap, so that if you put UV-rich lights out next to a white sheet at night in the tropics, you get this amazing selection of insects attracted. I mean, isn't that? It's just, I would have loved to have seen that. But the same, exactly the same guy is trapping today. Well, not literally today, but up to the present. And that's the same time of year, a typical catch to now, which is pretty terrifying, isn't it? And this again is a national park. This is not farmland or somewhere where you might expect insects to be declining. So far as we can tell, there's been a really catastrophic decline in insect abundance, probably over the last 100 years. We don't really know when it began because we don't have good data going back earlier than the 1970s, really. The only most people though have noticed nothing because it's been a gradual decline over decades, and people don't pay much attention to insects. So why would they notice? The only thing people have noticed is this. I'm sure, well, so if you're old enough, you will remember a time when if you drove any distance in the summer, your windscreen became opaque and you had to stop and clean it because you literally couldn't see where you were going because of all the bugs you'd splatted, poor things. Um, but at some point in the last few decades, that stopped happening. It's quite hard to pinpoint exactly when it was. But today you can drive quite a long time. Um, and have very few splats on your windscreen. There were one or two this year, I thought, but far, far fewer than there used to be. And the cartoonist has gone on to predict what that means for the rest of us. And he's trying to he's it's he has an interesting point. I think what he's trying to say is that basically we depend upon insects, and if the insects go, then we're in trouble ourselves. And there's good reason to say that because insects are incredibly important to ecosystems. The terrestrial ecosystems wouldn't really work without them. And I'm just going to run through what insects are good for, as it were, in case you need convincing. So insects are food for an enormous number of creatures. Lots of birds, most bats, lots of reptiles, amphibians, and of course freshwater fish. Many of them feed on insects. So if the insects go, they're going to go. But insects aren't just important as food. They do lots of other things. They deliver what scientists call ecosystem services. Um, Things like helping to control crop pest numbers, ladybirds, hoverflies, lacewings, earwigs, and so on. Or recycling cowpats in the case of the dung beetle there, top right, or helping to bury and recycle dead bodies in the case of the burying beetle, the red and black one in the middle there. There are insects that help keep the soil healthy and they distribute seeds. And so essentially they're busy doing all sorts of jobs that we kind of take for granted if we're even aware of them. They're not glamorous jobs, but they need doing by somebody. The only thing that insects do that most people are aware of, I think, these days, is what these insects are doing. And of course, that's pollination. Um, Many people mistakenly think it's all done by one species of bee, the honeybee, which is not true. Pollination is delivered by thousands of species of bee, wasp, butterfly, moth, fly, beetle, and so on. And between them, the very large majority of plants in the world rely on them for pollination. I think 87% of all plants rely on animal pollination of some sort. Um, so they would all stop setting seed and ultimately disappear if they weren't pollinated. And of course, there's the very obvious, I'm sure familiar argument that we rely directly on those pollinators too. Roughly three-quarters of all the crops we grow in the world wouldn't give a full harvest without being visited by some kind of insect. So we're used to our supermarkets being chock full of this amazing array of fruits and veg, but if you take away the crops that are pollinated by insects, wouldn't look so good. We would have far fewer apples, cherries, tomatoes, um, strawberries, raspberries, blueberries, even things like coffee and chocolate are insect pollinated. So um, uh, things would be pretty bleak without pollinators, and people would starve, is the awful truth. So there are really good practical reasons to argue why we should look after insects. Um, for selfish reasons, because we need them. Um, but I've always found that argument slightly unsatisfying because it doesn't really capture why I think we should conserve insects. It seems quite a selfish view, and it worries me that, um, you know, I think we should look after insects for their own sake, whether they do anything useful or not. And there are insects that probably don't do anything useful, but does that mean they can just go extinct? So it's a bit of a weird example, but there's an earwig, the world's biggest earwig, the St. Helena giant earwig, which lived on St. Helena, as you might guess, tiny island in the South Atlantic. It's about 7 centimeters long, so it was a whopper of an earwig. Um, Lived in seabird colonies. Sadly, it's almost certainly now extinct. Um, hasn't been seen for 50, 60 years. It went quietly extinct. We think they were all eaten by rats that were accidentally introduced. But there was no repercussions. It wasn't doing anything vital so far as we can tell. But doesn't it, I think the world seems it's a sadder world for not having a giant earwig in it, even if none of us were ever going to go and see this creature. Um, I think it deserved its place. And I would go further and say that I would argue that all species on the planet have as much right to be here as we do. Um, anyway, I don't want to go off on a tangent. Um, so insects are in decline. If we're going to fix that, we need to understand why they're declining. And there are lots of drivers. It's not simple, unfortunately. They're all man-made, and people argue about which one is most important, and it probably varies depending on where you are and what insects you're interested in. But loss of habitat is undoubtedly important. Pesticide use is what I'm going to talk about mainly tonight, but there are lots of other issues as well, which I won't go into, but you can imagine climate change, light pollution, and so on and so on. But let's focus on pesticides for today. So you're probably familiar with this book. I doubt many people have actually read it, but Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was published in 1962, 3 years before I was born. So it's been around a while, and it was the first. She was the first person to really flag up that pesticides were harmful. It hadn't seemingly occurred to anyone that there might be side effects of using pesticides. They were introduced pretty much during and after the Second World War. Um, Things like DDT and organophosphates. And they enabled huge increases in crop yields for a short while at least. And everyone was terribly enthusiastic about them. But Rachel noticed that there were some pretty awful side effects accumulating, that they were becoming less effective as insect pests became resistant, and farmers were applying more and more, and wildlife was starting to die. Humans were becoming ill. It wasn't quite such a wonderful solution that everyone had thought it was. So we're now 60 odd years later. The sad truth, I think lots of people think we solved the problem in the 1980s. We banned the pesticides that Carson was concerned about, things like DDT. It's now pretty much globally banned. And I think everyone thought the new pesticides were much safer. They were much better uh, tested and regulated. Um, but I'm afraid I don't think that's actually true. And if she knew, I think Rachel Carson would be turning in her grave. So let me tell you a bit about this, where we are now. Um, so in her day, there were about 40 pesticides used by farmers. Today in the United States, where she was based, there are about 1,000 different active ingredients, different toxins available. And the year-on-year global use of pesticides has increased um, steadily and hugely since her time. We're now up to about 4 million tons of what's basically poison being applied to the landscape every year. Um, and some of these compounds are much more toxic. So I'm going to talk a bit shortly about things like neonicotinoids, which compared to DDT are 7,000 times more toxic to insect life. And we're spraying hundreds of tons of them onto the landscape. Actually, to be fair, we're quite lucky in Europe. Our regulatory system is the most rigorous in the world. It's far from perfect, but it's a lot better than other countries. Um, we don't allow things like this, for example, which is a common sight in the Americas, where crops are sprayed from the air, and you can see it's not a precise art. That pesticide is going all over the place. Um, in the developed world, developing world, the global south, there are all sorts of horrendous problems where pesticides are increasingly used, but with very little regulation, and often used by people with no training and with ancient equipment. I took this picture in um, just outside Calcutta a few years ago now, and this guy is applying paraquat, which is a herbicide which we banned in Europe in 2007 because it's really, really poisonous to people. You only have to drink a drop of it and you'll die. And this guy is spraying it with his old brass sort of hand pump sprayer. He's got sandals on, he's got no gloves on, he's got no breathing apparatus on. is completely unprotected. It's really sad. And you'll be amazed, I suspect, to hear, where does paraquat come from? Huddersfield. We manufacture most of the world's paraquat in the UK. It's banned for use in Europe, but we're more than happy to sell it to people in third world countries. Um, Anyway, it's all a bit depressing, really. I got interested in pesticides through bees about 15 years ago. Um, I've specialised in studying bumblebees for the last 35 years, but in about, I guess, 2008, I became aware of a breaking kind of story relating to the impacts of a group of insecticides called neonicotinoids, which were suspected of harming bees. Neonicotinoids are they're neurotoxins. They attack the nervous system of insects. They are the chemicals that are roughly 7,000 times more toxic to insects than DDT and the like. On the left there, I've listed the main. So the neonicotinoids is a family of insecticides, and there are different chemicals within that family, including imidacloprid and various other ones. And at the bottom, I've also added fipronil, which technically is not a neonicotinoid, but it behaves in a very, very similar way, and it's also a neurotoxin. So I've included it with them for today. Um, anyway, so the main use of neonicotinoids was as a seed dressing. So that blue stuff you're looking at, those are seeds, actually oilseed rape seeds, treated with a coating of insecticide, and a dye is added so the farmer knows they're treated seeds. And the idea is that it protects the young crop plant as it grows from insect pests. Um, but So these chemicals were introduced in Europe in 1995, and fairly soon afterwards, people became concerned that they were harming bees. The warning was first raised by French beekeepers who noticed that if they put their hives next to fields of sunflowers, which had been treated as seeds with these neonicotinoids, these new insecticides, that their hives were dying. And they figured that these chemicals are known to be, the way they work is they're systemic, they're taken up by the roots of the plant, they spread through the tissues, and they get into the nectar and the pollen. So there's a fairly obvious route for bees to be exposed to these chemicals in this instance. But nonetheless, the French beekeepers were largely ignored for a long time. And the use of neonicotinoids increased and increased. They became hugely popular. Almost every arable crop in the world was treated with them. So I became interested, were these things killing bumblebees, which were my speciality? And I won't talk you through, we did research for years on this subject, um, but the important parts of it really relate to the fate of these chemicals when they're used. Um, so this diagram tries to explain um, what happens. So you have floating in the air in the middle there a dressed seed, could be one of those blue oilseed rape seeds, and the farmer drills the seed into the soil. There's a tiny bit of dust blows around, which is deadly to any insects flying nearby, but most of the coating goes into the ground with the seed. And then, as I mentioned, the idea is the seedling germinates and it grows and it absorbs the seed coating into the seedling itself. And that's how it protects it against insect pests, which is a clever, you can see from a farmer's perspective, he doesn't have to spray anything. He just buys the seed pre-treated and sows it in the ground and it grows and it's healthy. Brilliant. Except we discovered that actually the very large majority of the chemical is not going into the plant at all. It's not taken up by the plant's roots, it's going into the soil. And from there, it's either leaching downhill into ditches and streams and rivers, or it's leaching into the hedgerows where there might be a field margin full of wildflowers or hedgerow shrubs that flower. And just as the crop takes up some of the pesticide from the soil, so do the field margin plants and They're hedgerow shrubs. So things like May blossom, when it flowers, if it was next to a field that had been treated the year before with one of these seed dressed crops, the hawthorn nectar and pollen would be just as contaminated as the crop was. So we managed by using these crops not just to poison bees that visited flowering crops like sunflowers or oilseed rape, but to poison the entire landscape with these neurotoxic insecticides. Um, and just to illustrate the scale of this pollution, this is a study done on, it was by a Swiss lab, but they got samples of honey from honeybee hives from all around the world. Each little dot is a honeybee hive sample. Um, and the color of the dot indicates what they screened them for these neonicotinoid pesticides. The white ones are clean samples. 75% of the samples they got contained neonicotinoid insecticide. Um, so 3/4 of the world's honeybees have a really potent neurotoxin in their food store, which is bad. It has to be said. And this isn't just about poisoning honeybees, because the honeybees are being poisoned by gathering contaminated nectar, which means that all the thousands of other species of pollinating insect, including my bumblebees, are also being poisoned at the same time. And this is clearly, as you can see, a global phenomenon. We've poisoned the nectar in flowers all around the world with just this. And this is just one group of insecticides. I'm sure if you'd analysed those samples of honey, you'd have found lots of other pesticides besides. Anyway, by about 2015, it became pretty obvious that this was a catastrophe. There were lots of studies emerging. I won't go through all of these, but very quickly, work showing that honeybee colonies in the UK were dying near oilseed rape crops. That UK wild bees, we've got about 270 species, that their rates of decline were accelerating in places where these chemicals were used. Likewise, butterflies in the UK, California, birds being affected in the Netherlands, particularly insectivorous birds. Freshwater insects also in the Netherlands declining in areas that were more polluted with these pesticides. There was a global problem. There still is a global problem, but I'll come back to that. So this is a bit of a boring slide, but it just shows you the sort of timeline. And actually, from a European perspective, this is quite a nice story because it shows an environmental problem emerging and actually being dealt with for once by government. So what happened was I mentioned these chemicals were introduced in 94, 95, and French beekeepers flagged up that they were killing their bees. They were ignored for a while, but eventually it became clear that the French beekeepers were right. If their bees visited flowering crops like sunflowers that had been treated, they were dying. And so the European Union banned the use of these chemicals on flowering crops. But evidence continued to emerge from my own lab and lots of others showing that that wasn't solving the problem because we'd also polluted all the wildflowers. And so in 2018, the European Union went further and it completely banned all farming uses of neonicotinoids, which was amazing. I was so happy that day. They did allow what are called derogations, which was basically sort of emergency approvals for particular crops. And you might have heard of this because the UK allowed these derogations on sugar beet for a few years. But in 2023, the European Union banned those derogations entirely, and Britain carried on being the only country in Europe using these neonics for a couple of years. But thankfully, people complain a lot about the Labour government, but they've done some good things, and that was one of them. They've banned, they stopped, refused to grant a derogation for any crops in the UK. So now neonics are not used in farming at all anywhere in Europe. They're still used everywhere else in the world, but at least in Europe, we've solved the problem. Except we haven't, because in 2017, Bug Life published this report. This was written by Matt Shardlow, who used to be the head of Bug Life, about neonicotinoids in British fresh waters. Um, and it contained this map which showed um, river samples that had been screened for imidacloprid, one of these neonics. And the orange and red ones were badly contaminated. The yellow ones were contaminated at lower levels, and the green ones were clean. And it shows what you'd expect, that most of the contamination is in the more intensively arable parts of Britain, particularly the East Anglia there. Um, but there was something odd, particularly in Scotland, because this river up here, the yellow one, was miles from any arable agriculture. It was only had a bit of imidacloprid in it, but it raised the question of where the heck was it coming from? And many of us kind of mulled over this, and we looked into, well, were there any other uses for these chemicals that could explain this river contamination in remote mountain regions? And of course, it then emerged that although they'd been banned in farming, these chemicals were still being used on cats and dogs. Um, and nobody seemed to have even noticed that they were the same chemicals that we'd all been arguing about the farmers using. So, in case you're not familiar with this issue, vets will very commonly advise you to prophylactically treat your dog or cat against fleas and ticks by squeezing some drops of liquid onto the neck of your dog. Um, Two of the common products that are the most widely sold ones are Advocate there on the left. I don't know whether you can see my mouse, but the active ingredient there, it says in tiny font, imidacloprid. Um, the amount of imidacloprid that you're supposed to apply every month to the neck of a medium-sized dog is enough to kill, if I can remember correctly, to give a lethal dose to 62 million honeybees. And you're supposed to put it on your dog every month, 12 times a year. Even if your dog doesn't have fleas or ticks. This other product here is Frontline, is based on fipronil, which is this very similar compound. So it occurred to us that, okay, if these things are on dogs and dogs like to swim, then that could explain contamination of rivers in remote regions. I managed to persuade DEFRA, or the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, which is part of DEFRA, to fund a PhD to see whether this was really the case, whether we were polluting rivers by allowing pesticide-treated dogs to swim in them. So we got the funding, and I was lucky enough to get Rose Perkins, who she was a qualified vet, but fancied doing a PhD to work on this project. And she had 4 years to look at the environmental fate of these chemicals after they're applied to the neck of dogs and cats. So first of all, she looked at in more detail at Environment Agency data on river contamination. So she got data from 20 English rivers. You can see the yellow ones. So sorry, I'll rewind a bit. This shows contamination with fipronil. I haven't got a similar map for imidacloprid, but it would look very similar. You look on the left-hand map to start with. Each triangle is a river. The yellow ones, of which there aren't many, had low levels of fipronil, but there was always some. The orange ones had levels that exceeded what are called the chronic toxicity limits. In other words, if they were to stay at that level long term, they're likely to do harm to invertebrate populations. And the red ones exceeded the acute toxicity limits, meaning that even in the short term, those concentrations are going to be killing insects. So you can see that every river contained fipronil at some level. 19 out of 20 rivers also contained imidacloprid. I forget which one was clean. So we've got 2 insecticides in every single English river. What Rose noticed, though, which is really interesting, was that the highest levels tended to be downstream of where wastewater treatment works were feeding into the rivers. And those are marked, you may struggle to see them, but the little exclamation marks on the triangles are samples downstream of a wastewater treatment works. And nearly all of those had much higher levels of these insecticides than samples upstream, which suggested that it wasn't so much dogs swimming, although that still remains an issue, but the, the pesticides applied to dogs and cats were finding their way down the drain from people's homes and ending up in rivers that way. Rose spent her 4 years looking into this in great detail, did some really important studies where she got lots of dog owners to volunteer their dogs, and they were treated with these chemicals, and then they were washed. You see that dog looking not entirely happy, bottom right there, um, and as mimicking what would happen if someone, needed to wash their dog because it got muddy, or took it to the poodle parlor if they wanted to get it shampooed or whatever. Um, and then Rose tested the water that the dog had been washed in to see how much pesticide came off. She also washed their bedding, mimicking what would happen if someone washed their dog or cat's bed in the washing machine, and tested the concentration of pesticide in the wastewater coming out of the washing machine. And she also got the pet owners to stroke their dogs and then tested their hands for the pesticides. And she did this at different time intervals after the dogs had been treated, 5, 14, and 28 days, if I remember correctly. Um, and she managed to show that. So I'll spare you the very complicated calculations she did, because to be honest, I'm not sure I ever really fully understood them, but Rose could explain it beautifully. The essential point is that she worked out that if about 18 to 20% of the product that's applied to dogs and cats ended up going down the drains, that would be enough to explain the concentrations found in wastewater treatment work effluent. Um, and that washing the dogs contributed quite significantly, washing the bedding contributed significantly. But actually, the biggest route that she identified was hands, the owner's hands. Every time you touch your dog, you get these insecticides on your hands, and then every time you then wash your hands, a small amount goes down the drain. It's a small amount each time, but people touch their dogs a lot and wash their hands fairly often during the day. So cumulatively, that turned out to be the biggest route for these chemicals going into wastewater. Um, she did also look at dogs swimming. Um, this shows you the amount of active ingredient of fipronil and imidacloprid. So fipronil's on the left, imidacloprid on the right. That comes off a dog at 5, 14, and 28 days post being treated. So, for example, on the right there, you can see that about 10% of the product you applied to your dog 5 days earlier washes off if you allow the dog to swim, 5 days later. Bear in mind, looking at these, that the recommendations that come with these products are that you shouldn't let your dog swim for 2 days, 48 hours after it's been treated. But clearly, there's a whole load of chemicals still on the dog 5, 14, even 28 days after. So, advising people not to let their dogs swim for a couple of days it probably helps a little bit, but is not preventing pollution of rivers from dogs swimming. And in fact, independent of our work, Imperial College became interested in this too. And they did a study of these flea treatment levels in ponds on Hampstead Heath, where there's an awful lot of dogs go swimming, um, and found this really neat correlation between the the number of dogs per hour swimming in the water and the amount of pesticide found in the water. So you've got imidacloprid on the left and fipronil on the right in this instance, and in both cases, there's a very tight correlation. Basically, more dogs, more pesticide, exactly as you would expect. Um, Ah, it, and this really matters. These aren't just tiny amounts that aren't consequential. The green dotted line, horizontal line in those two graphs shows you the safe limit for these chemicals. And you can see that they've been massively exceeded on the ponds on Hampstead Heath and many of the rivers that Rose looked at. Um, and just to show you that what damage these things can do, let me show you and flip across the world to Japan. Um, that picture at the top there is of Lake Shinji, which is the biggest freshwater lake in Japan, um, which is surrounded by rice paddies. And they started using neonicotinoids there in 1993. The chart shows you zooplankton biomass in the lake over time. It was monitored quite closely, so it's a really good long-term data set. And you can see the impact of the runoff from the rice paddies. Freshwater pollution with these chemicals can have really dramatic impacts on invertebrate abundance in the water. Um, just a little side note, we've also discovered, of course, I've focused entirely on pollution of rivers, which is where all the, the focus of this research has been. But it's quite likely, if you stop to think about it, that if you've got a dog covered in insecticide, other things are going to be contaminated apart from the wastewater. Your garden is likely to be contaminated. Maybe the flowers in your garden will be contaminated. Another of my PhD students, Canal, discovered that the lining of birds' blue tit and great tit nests, which is they line them with animal fur, mainly dog and cat fur when they're in urban areas. 100% of 104 nests that she tested contained these insecticides in the nest lining, which the little chicks are nestled up in. And it's not completely conclusive. She's doing more work looking into this right now, but there were more dead chicks or unhatched eggs in nests with higher concentrations of the pesticide. So potentially, we're not just poisoning rivers, but we're poisoning garden birds as well, which is pretty scary. And maybe we're poisoning ourselves too, because I've mentioned several times that if your dog is treated with an insecticide that stays on its fur for weeks, and every time you touch it, you're getting those insecticides on your hand, then isn't that slightly concerning? And let me just share some information from some other studies that I've come across. So, firstly, there was a recent study from Switzerland which managed to get hold of cerebrospinal fluid samples from 14 children and tested them for imidacloprid, and every single sample was positive. Now we've no idea how those children were exposed, um, but that's pretty concerning because the cerebrospinal fluid, these are neurotoxins, and the cerebrospinal fluid is the liquid that bathes your brain and your spine. It surely isn't good that it's got insecticide in it. Um, Switching to fipronil, a French study found fipronil in every single cord blood sample from newborn babies. And the higher levels of fipronil were associated with what they call low APGAR scores, which are basically as soon as a baby is born, there's a standardized way of assessing how healthy and vigorous it seems to be. And babies with lots of fipronil in their blood were less healthy, not surprisingly, perhaps. And there have been lots of other studies showing that fipronil exposure is harmful to humans, and yet we're using it in our house on a routine basis. It just seems pretty bonkers to me. I'm probably more or less out of time. I've got a couple more minutes, so just let me. I'll skim through this because it's a bit depressing. And so it's just a very crowded slide. You're always told not to do this. I just wanted to sort of round up the pesticide stuff by talking about some of the evidence for global pollution with pesticides. Things I discovered recently. I'm writing a book about pesticides and their impacts globally. There are pesticides in the air, believe it or not. If you just sample the air, even in remote parts of the world, you can detect things like glyphosate herbicide. Um, there are pesticides in the water droplets in clouds, in the rain when it falls. Um, the snow at the North and South Pole is full of pesticides, as are the livers of penguins and walruses and albatross and so on. Um, those insects on German nature reserves, they recently tested them and found 47 pesticides in insects on nature reserves. Hair of pregnant women, 43 pesticides on average per woman. Uh, a Dutch study found 21 pesticides in the dust bunnies under the beds of people's homes, which is all pretty terrifying, I have to say. It does make me think that, maybe we've just been blind to some terrible emerging issue that could be doing all sorts of damage that we haven't really begun to understand, I fear. Who knows? Maybe I'm just doom mongering. I just wanted to say a few more things. I'll speed up. So what can we actually do? Well, firstly, we can support low pesticide farming, organic farming, or more reduced pesticide use farming. Another thing that many people can get involved in is making our gardens more wildlife friendly. If you want to know more about the first of those, I'm just going to blatantly plug my new book, which isn't out until May next year, but it's all about how to minimize your own exposure to pesticides and your food footprint. Um, but let me just say a few things about garden rewilding and particularly good reasons to not use pesticides in your garden. Encouraging wildlife in a garden is a really nice thing that loads of people can get involved in. There are 22 million gardens in the UK. They cover about 500,000 hectares of land. Just imagine if they were all pesticide free, full of wildflowers and so on. It would really make a difference. I don't know why we don't ban pesticide use for gardeners. I think it's completely nuts. Um, that you can go to the supermarket or the garden centre or the DIY shop and buy any of a whole range of poisons to spray around your garden. I mentioned my student Canal earlier. She's done some interesting studies which are publicly freely available online on what factors affect butterfly, bumblebee, and bird abundance in gardens, including the effect of pesticides. And she found that there were fewer birds, particularly house sparrows, in gardens using pesticides, particularly herbicides like glyphosate, and more butterfly species in gardens that were pesticide free. There is a direct effect, seemingly, of using pesticides in your gardens on biodiversity. Not surprisingly, when you stop to think about it. Um, so don't use them, please, and encourage your neighbours and friends to not use them. France banned urban pesticide use completely in 2018, and Paris is still standing, hasn't been overrun by giant cockroaches or dandelions or anything. And if Paris can be pesticide free, I really don't see why London and Brighton and everywhere else in Britain can't be pesticide free as well. I'll skip that one. I just wanted to finish off by flagging up. It's nothing really to do with pesticides, but the Buzz Club. If you're at all interested in garden wildlife, check out the Buzz Club. It's a little citizen science club that I'm involved in at the University of Sussex, which is trying to build the evidence base for wildlife gardening. Lots of wildlife gardening products have not been tested. Some of them, I think, are actually complete rubbish. But we're involving people in doing experiments to find out which ones really work best, so that we can advise people how to encourage more wildlife successfully to their garden. So, for example, we've got a big bee hotel experiment going on every year, which you might join in the spring, testing out different types of bee hotel. It's fun for anyone of all ages, good for kids. In many ways, I think that's one of the big benefits of citizen science programs is that it involves people and helps to connect them with nature, and hopefully stops people putting up silly signs telling us to run away. There's an insect, as though I showed you earlier. Anyway, sorry for that canter through the last bit. That's me done. Thank you ever so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dave. That was absolutely fascinating. I've scribbled down loads of notes of my own. This is part of my job is public messaging and trying to get the message out about the use of pet flea and tick treatments and the impact that they're having on our waterways. So you've given me a whole arsenal of information here that I can use. So thank you for that. We've got a number of questions coming in thick and fast. So we'll try and get through as many of these as we can. I think some of them are kind of similar, so I'll try and roll them up um, into one question if possible. So Jim is asking whether the flea and worming tablets that we can give to our dogs are less likely to transmit into waterways and hence affect wildlife. So are tablets better than the spot-on treatments?
Yeah, so a lot of vets, because they're worried about these spot-ons, are recommending Bravecto and other similar products, which are tablets that do the same thing. They're also really potent insecticides and very persistent in the environment, but they're probably not going to be on the outside of the dog. But they are going to go somewhere. They're not just going to magically disappear. They're probably going to be in the urine and the feces. So if your dog goes out into the countryside or in your back garden, which you might be managing for wildlife, that's probably not good either. Um, my recommendation, and thankfully the British Veterinary Association are all supporting this now, is that you shouldn't be using these things, you shouldn't be using anything prophylactically. You should only treat your dog if it actually has a problem, if it's regularly being infested with ticks or fleas. Um, and that would probably get rid of 80–90% of the use immediately, which would go a long way to solving the problem. Also, if just preventative measures like washing your dog or cat's bedding regularly to kill the larval fleas which live in the bedding rather than on the animal is a really simple way to keep fleas in check. Using a flea comb, much more sustainable than putting a neurotoxin on your dog. If all that fails, personally, I have found diatomaceous earth to be effective against fleas. It's only based on having used it once on my dog and once on my chickens, but both times it worked really well, and it's completely inert and harmless stuff, and very cheap to buy online. Diatomaceous earth is my tip. But yeah, do beware of alternative, insecticidal drugs because they all have an environmental cost, sadly.
Thank you. So Nick is asking about plants for pollinators. So Nick only has a balcony. Can you recommend three or four plants that would tick most pollinator needs as space is at a premium?
Yeah, sure. My book, Gardening for Bumblebees, has a lot of advice, but three or four. Catmint is fabulous. Marjoram is one of my favorites. Lavender or thyme would also be really good and grow very well in pots. So yeah, I mean, there's loads to choose from. Bird's foot trefoil, if I can squeeze in a fifth one. Um, all of them don't need that much space and really attractive to pollinators. But there are so many to choose from. Generally speaking, head towards native wildflowers where you can.
Okay, there's a question here. Beverly fosters cats for the RSPCA and finds it frustrating that even though they are kept indoors, Beverly has to give them a monthly flea treatment. So this is RSPCA policy, apparently. And she has read Silent Spring.
Very
Um,
good. Top marks, Beverly.
yeah. Um,
Um, yeah,
I didn't know that about the RSPCA.
no,
It's quite interesting.
that's really interesting. And it's something that, I'm sure the sad thing is that it's all well-meaning. I'm sure the RSPCA made that rule for thinking it was the right thing to do, completely oblivious to the fact that there might be, you know, downsides to using these chemicals. But yeah, somebody, I guess me, needs to flag this up with them and see if we can have any sway on their policy. I imagine it might be quite difficult to change, but it's really interesting. I had no idea. I mean, what a stupid thing. If your
Hmm.
cat is indoors all the time, why the heck would you be treating it for
Yeah.
fleas?
Yeah, I think maybe engaging with the RSPCA on this would be really valuable, actually. I think that would be
Yeah,
interesting. Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay. So Liz has been offered a number of bulbs. I was pretty sure they've been sprayed at some point. Should she still plant them or look for organic alternatives?
Uh, it's a tricky one. I mean, they probably will have been sprayed. I skipped one slide which was about the fact that the bee-friendly plants on sale in supermarkets are all full of pesticides. Um, and it's true that the horticulture industry uses a shed load of pesticides. So most plants on sale in garden centres are full of insecticides and fungicides and all sorts. One plant we tested had 10 different pesticides in it, and it was being sold as bee friendly.
Wow.
Um, but if you've already got the bulbs, and the pesticides will dissipate eventually if there are any, I'd be tempted to plant them, but just in future, try and find organic suppliers if you can. There are some really nice organic suppliers of bee-friendly plants. Off the top of my head, there's a nursery called Rosie Bee Nursery, which does mail order. Um, I don't know whether they do a range of bulbs, but certainly they're really good for herbaceous plants, and they're all organic and homegrown, which is great. Um, so yeah, do beware.
There's a couple of similar questions about how long neonics stay in the soil or in the environment, and also are they used in horses, cattle, and sheep?
Um, Hang on. How long do they stay in the soil? Unfortunately, several years. They slowly disappear, but the half-life, the time it takes for half of it to go, it varies on the soil type, and it's hard to generalize. But we know that there are fields that have been arable fields that have been tested 4 years after the last crop was planted with neonics, and they still got some neonics in them. So they're around for a while, but they will be disappearing from farm soils. They should mostly be gone by now because they've been more or less banned now for quite a few years. Um, Now, what was the other one? Horses, cattle, and sheep. I don't th horses, cattle, and sheep, but I have a nagging feeling that there's some obscure use on of some parasite that lives on horses' legs that may be treated with fipronil. I'm not 100% sure, but I think there is.
Okay. Next question. This was also about the tablets, so I think you've answered that one. Um, Somebody from Luxembourg asking, beekeepers use small dilutions of frontline containing fipronil and drip them onto Asian hornets. So the
Crikey.
hornets carry the poison back to the nest. How dangerous
Yeah.
might this be?
Um, I've not heard of that. I mean, the Asian hornet is a huge new threat to not just to honeybees, but to flying insects. Sadly, they're voracious predators that are spreading through Europe and look as if they've probably crossed the channel and they're getting established in Britain in the last year. Um, uh, but I've not. I would. I mean, the DEFRA in the UK has a control strategy. If you come across any Asian hornets, ring the Asian Hornet helpline. I don't have the number to hand, but if you Google it, you'll find it. And DEFRA will send out a crack team of Asian Hornet killers, so you don't need to do it yourself anyway in the UK. Uh,
Hmm.
I would, yeah, it seems like a really bad idea to be using insecticides to kill one type of insect because you're going to kill a load of others as well, I would
Yeah.
imagine.
Yeah, I don't know if the beekeepers in Luxembourg are doing that legally. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
who knows? I
yeah,
would guess
interesting.
probably not.
No. Okay. So I'm talking about dog licensing. So suggesting that dog owners should have a license, and they no license without some serious education.
Yeah, I mean that it's hard to argue, but that some kind of um, incentive to dog owners to behave well. We all know there are lots of things that badly behaved dogs have all sorts of impacts on wildlife. defecating all over the place, disturbing nesting birds and so on if they're not managed properly. So yeah, I mean, I had never thought about that really. It's been not really my area,
No.
but superficially seems like a good idea to me.
Um, so is it any evidence of harm to dogs from these
Well,
treatments?
some people claim so. I mean, there are if you go online, particularly there are quite a few people in the United States who reckon that their dogs have had fits and seizures, and in some cases died as a result of, almost immediately after the treatment was applied. I don't know. I mean, the millions of people use these things. It seems if it does have an obvious harmful effect, it must be very rare. Because we're otherwise there'd be dead dogs and cats all over the place. Um, but look, whether there's any long-term, cumulative effect on their health is really much harder to say. It doesn't seem like a great idea to, be dripping neurotoxin on your dog.
No,
And as I said earlier, there's evidence of harm to humans. So, we're physiologically pretty similar to dogs. So it doesn't sound ideal from a dog health perspective, but yeah, I don't think there's any conclusive evidence one way or the other.
okay. We have just gone over 8 o'clock. Can you stay for a little bit longer, Dave?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Just trying to see if there's questions on a different topic. Um, so Alison's saying that she made the mistake of buying some garden insecticide to treat mites years ago. Haven't used it when she realised it was full of neonics. Is there a safe way to dispose of it?
Uh, if you go to your local waste disposal place, they have a special should have a special cupboard for putting, unwanted pesticides in. I think they're incinerated, so which is probably as good a thing to do with them as any.
Yeah. Um, Jeff is asking some of the links to the other 10 studies you mentioned about human health issues.
Yeah, sure. I have. I mean, I don't have them to hand, but I can send some. Um, I don't know what the easiest method is.
Yeah, if you send any links to me, Dave, then I can make sure everybody gets them afterwards.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, great, thank you. How do we change people's perception of supermarket bought herbicides, or is there any movement to ban them?
Um, there's been a campaign running for years by Pesticide Action Network. I don't know whether people have heard of them, but they're a
Yeah.
charity based in Brighton that I think they're really good. They give very sensible, evidence-based advice on alternatives to herbicides in streets in particular. Because in Brighton's been a interesting ongoing battle over they banned glyphosate herbicides and then unbanned it. Um, because there was a lot of complaints that there were weeds sprouting up in the pavements, and somebody claimed to have tripped over and sprained their wrist or something. Um, it's worth looking at their website. There's lots of information there. But um, my I think the strongest argument is that aside from, obviously spraying weeds willy-nilly with herbicides does have environmental impacts. Um, there's a human health risk here. Glyphosate was described by the World Health Organization as a probable carcinogen, and there have been some prominent court cases in the United States where non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and successfully then sued the company that manufactures it for billions of dollars, and I don't exaggerate. So if I was the council, I'd be really nervous about employing people to go and spray glyphosate, because if those people subsequently were to develop a cancer and want to blame their employers, they'd have every right to do so, I would think. And I kind of think that that's maybe as powerful an argument as any to the council to stop doing this, because they do run the risk of being bankrupted down the line. Um, But more, I mean, also, doesn't it seem bonkers that we were spraying our streets? And I've seen glyphosate being sprayed on children's play equipment in parks.
Mm,
What the heck? I mean, we managed without glyphosate for a very long time. It came on the market in 1976. The world survived without it beforehand, so I'm sure we could do without it again.
absolutely. Um, Tom's, I don't know if you've answered this. How long are neonics active? Will they degrade and how long?
Yeah, I mean, I talked about them degrading in soil, and
Yeah.
that's the thing we know best. And it really depends. They do degrade. They degrade more if they're exposed to sunlight. Um, But if they're in soil in the dark or in the sludge in the bottom of a ditch or a pond or whatever, they can last for years and years and years. But they will slowly disappear. And it's nice that at least most uses of, the bulk of the use was arable, and at least that's now behind us.
Hmm.
But
So now they've been banned. They won't persist indefinitely. They will
no, they
degrade.
will be. But of course, we're still obviously still using imidacloprid on our pets. So
Yes, yes. Um, um, so Jeff's saying he's used cedar side, as in cedar tree, I presume.
sorry,
Um,
I didn't quite catch that.
um, Jeff is using cedar side on his dog.
Oh, okay.
In Scotland, in high tick prevalence, found it to be highly effective.
Yeah, there are quite a lot. I mean, there's a diet supplement that I called. It's got the great name Billy No Mates, which it's supposed to make your dog smell unattractive to ticks and fleas. And I've had people who've used it who swear by it. I never tried it myself, but well, obviously not myself, but my dog hasn't. Um, and But I do think, the sensible thing to do would be to investigate whether there are completely benign, sustainable alternatives, like diatomaceous earth or cedarcide or billinomates or whatever. Do these things actually work? 'Cause
Mm,
if they do, the whole problem would go away.
yeah,
And of course, there's not large amounts of money to be made from selling herbal dietary additions or that kind of thing, or diatomaceous earth. So the industry would not be happy,
yeah,
but the environment would.
yeah, absolutely. Um, so Rachel's asking, in your experience, is a top-down or bottom-up approach been more effective in implementing change, i.e., government policy or consumerism choice? And also, as a young ecologist, what piece of advice would you give me to have impact during my career?
Oh, crikey. Um, top up, it varies, to be honest. I don't think there's any right answer as to whether top down or bottom up works best. The EU banning of neonics shows that sometimes top down can be really effective, and it's by far the quickest way to get meet big change. If the government changes the law, bang, bans something or whatever. Um, if DEFRA were to stop licensing fipronil or imidacloprid for use on dogs and cats, that would be that. Um, and it does happen occasionally, as the EU example proved, but our own government seemed to be quite slow, generally, to do anything. Um, and in the meantime, trying to influence things bottom up. Make dog owners aware, cat owners aware. As most dog owners are horrified when you tell them they had no idea that they were poisoning rivers and so on. Um, so spreading the word and more generally, trying to get more people engaged with environmental issues and voting green and making their garden wildlife friendly and all these, the small things that we can all do that collectively would make a really big difference. Um, it's just scaling them up, getting enough people involved, and it's tricky. I mean, if I knew how to do that, I would have done it. Um, but as for some brilliant advice for young ecologists, crikey, I mean, yeah, I'm a bit stumped on that one. Other than just, I mean, obviously don't get depressed and give up. We can't give up. There's never going to be a time when we should give up. because there's always going to be something to save and something to fight for. That's not perhaps the best advice in the world, but it's the best I can do right now.
I think that's great advice. Okay, I'm just going to do a couple of others and then we'll wrap up. Um, so someone was asking the website that you were talking about was the Pesticide Action Network
Yeah.
website. Yeah, I definitely wholeheartedly recommend that website as well. It's got absolutely brilliant, really practical advice on it as well. And if you want to persuade your local council to go pesticide free, there's loads of really good resources on there. Um, Someone's asking if if there's a leaflet or flyer available on this topic, and I've looked for this myself, and I haven't failed to find anything that's really
No,
useful.
that I'm pretty sure there isn't, sadly.
Yeah.
That's something that would be
So
useful, I guess.
yeah, so
But
that is something that I will be working on. So hopefully the Western Sussex Rivers Trust will be producing a flyer and using some of the information that I've gathered from this webinar.
well, happy to chip in,
Oh, that'd be
to give
great. Thank you,
advice or
Dave.
whatever.
Yeah, yeah, some real solid science behind it is absolutely crucial. And this is a question I was wondering as well. Whether the explosion in dog ownership um, has had an equally significant impact on toxin levels entering our ecosystem. Do the major NGOs have the stomach to discourage pet ownership, especially
Yeah,
as it
that's a
may affect
thorny
their
issue,
trading
isn't it?
activities?
I mean, it's bound to have increased the number of these chemicals going into the environment, sadly. Um, but no, I mean, certainly the big NGOs have always been pretty cagey when it comes to dogs and cats. I mean, cats in particular, it's pretty obvious that they have a huge impact on birds and small mammals through the direct predation of, let alone chemical issues. But so far as I've seen, none of I'm sure RSPB are painfully aware that most of their 1.1 million members have got a dog or a cat, and they don't want to alienate them, I guess. So yeah, there's frustrating silence generally on that front.
Right. I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Dave, and sorry if I didn't get to all of the questions. I'm sure Dave will really appreciate getting all your emails about them.
Yeah, don't everybody email me, please.
Um, well, thank you so much, Dave. That's so useful, and I hope we can stay in touch as well.
Cool.
And the recording will be made available on our website, and I will email everyone who signed up, so everybody gets the link.
Okay, I'll say goodbye and head
Thank you
off.
so much for
Have
your
a good
time,
evening,
Dave.
everybody.
Thank you. Bye.